Welcome back. This is The Globe. I'm Tshepiso Makwetla. The United States and a host of allied countries have called on the Taliban to end the targeted killings of former members of Afghan security forces. In a joint statement, the 22 nations are demanding that the new Afghanistan regime respect its pledge not to harm former government or security personnel. Now, the call follows a damning report on killings and abductions by the Taliban government. The report was released by the Human Rights Watch earlier this week. It documented more than 100 executions and abductions of former Afghan government officials since the Taliban took control of the country almost 4 months ago. It's also documented the murder of 47 members of the Afghan security forces who surrendered or were captured by the Taliban between 15 August and 31 October. All right, we talk a little bit more about this. We're joined now by former Strategic Communications Advisor to the Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani, David Loyn. He is a visiting Senior Fellow, War Studies Department at King's College in London. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Mr. Loyn. So just the idea of the scale of alleged summary killings or forced disappearances, do we have any?
Well, you've got to remember that this Human Rights Watch report of several dozen people killed was only in 5 provinces. Now, there are 34 provinces in Afghanistan, so that doesn't cover anything like the whole country. So I think we're seeing, and we've certainly been hearing separately to this, very clear reporting by a very respectable organisation who talk to people on the ground as well as telephone interviews, that there is a widespread abuse now of ordinary basic norms of human behaviour, of human rights in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And I think the problem is that the Taliban themselves are not a united organisation. So even though the government in power, such as it is in Kabul, might want to tell the international community that there's an amnesty for former leaders of the former soldiers and former intelligence officials in the former government, the Republic government, even though they try and tell us that, they don't have control over all their different forces. I mean, to give you one example, an Afghan who I've met here in New York, who was very senior in the Afghan government, said the Taliban came to his house, where his family are still in Kabul, he's in America, and turned the house upside down, and the women were obviously very upset, and they called the Taliban, who said this won't happen again. But it did happen again, and the Taliban, who came the second time, when they called to say, look, we have some protection, there's nothing here, he's already gone, these Taliban said, no, we're not part of that group. So you've got lots of different groups running around who are not necessarily connected with the central government Taliban. And that's made Afghanistan a very dangerous country.
So how wide are the fissures within the Taliban? And I want to talk about the role of the United States. It ostensibly went into Afghanistan in a bid to bring to an end human rights abuses. When it withdrew, it was with that understanding of an amnesty which you speak about. Was it within its purview to disagree to the handover of certain territory because of a lack of guarantee on that?
Well, I think I think you're right that the Americans hoped that there would be better treatment of people in Afghanistan, but the Taliban never really committed to much. They committed only, really, that they wouldn't carry out international terrorist attacks. They did commit last year to having a ceasefire and to negotiating with the Afghan government. They didn't deliver on either of those, but yet the United States decided to pull out and President Biden decided to leave. And I think he'll be blamed for that. He's already being blamed politically here. And we're seeing the consequences of that rapid departure of American and other international forces this year, with the collapse of the Republic government, the collapse of the Republic's forces, and this chaos. And the other area that's really happening is not just intimidation and murder of former government servants, former civil servants, soldiers and intelligence officials of the former government, but also tit-for-tat revenge killing of other warlords across the country. And you've got to remember that the Taliban have been supported by significant criminal elements. I mean, they are in many ways as much an organized crime syndicate as they are an international jihadi organization. And I think we're seeing a lot of the sorts of things that you might see with criminal gangs fighting between each other for territory in these tit-for-tat killings that are going on in the country.
As you mentioned, the Human Rights Watch report does speak of interviews with families, victims. Are they themselves not in danger of reprisals for speaking to Human Rights Watch?
I think they are. I think these interviews were carried out obviously in conditions of enormous secrecy, and families of former soldiers are having to move house by house. And of course, it's very difficult to leave Afghanistan now. Even people who have valid visas to Pakistan are being turned back at the border, the Pakistani border. There are very, very few international flights, and people who, even with a valid international visa, or even maybe a foreign passport, are now stuck in the country and living absolutely, as you say, under significant peril, really. I think it's going to be difficult for the Taliban to keep this sort of intimidation going on in the months to come, because there are other really serious challenges that they're beginning to face. This is the worst drought for 37 years. People are really beginning to feel the effects of the collapse of the economy. There's very little money in circulation. Normal economic business is effectively collapsed. And, the World Food Programme and other organizations are talking about more than 20 million people starving in Afghanistan this winter. So I think the Taliban are beginning to face real issues. And you asked before about the divisions, the fissures within the Taliban. We've seen the so-called Kandahari Taliban, the people the Americans were talking to and thought would take power, pushed aside in favor of the Haqqani network, who are the principal people now in power in Kabul, although I say it's a divided movement. And it's those people who have a very strong international jihadi agenda. They are global terrorists, so very happy to support Al-Qaeda and other organizations. And although we see former President Karzai on the screen there, they haven't yet taken into custody any of the former leaders of the country. They're living relatively openly in Kabul. It really can be only a matter of time before things get much worse in Afghanistan.
So there are those who say reports of divisions with the Taliban aren't necessarily true, that the Taliban are much more united now than they were in 2001. But there have also been reports of not only physical altercations, but the details thereof between the moderate and the hardline networks or the groupings. As you're speaking about the Haqqani network faction, I believe that part of the argument was also with the Mullah Brada, who is a newly appointed Deputy Prime Minister, as well as Khalil al-Rahman, who is the new Refugees Minister. Now, if the United States and the other 21 countries are asking for an investigation into these reports, how likely then would that be if there is lack of cohesion?
I think it's that the international community have no leverage in Afghanistan. The Americans talk about having over-the-horizon counter-terrorist ability, i.e. potentially sending in drones or airstrikes if they fear that there are terrorist issues that they're facing. But it's difficult to see that they have any leverage at all. They can appeal to the Taliban, but the Haqqani network have no interest in the kinds of conditions that the international community might want to put on, for example, recognition for the Taliban administration. And we're seeing, as you know, the Taliban have taken power but are not recognized by the United Nations or formally by any countries in the world, although Pakistan, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have given them effective recognition by opening embassies in both countries. So there is a relationship that the Taliban are beginning to develop with some, as it were, like-minded Sunni fundamentalist countries. But in terms of the international community, America now has no leverage in Afghanistan. They've pulled back from the global leadership role that they had previously, both under President Trump and very much under President Biden, in order to let Afghanistan get on with its own devices. And of course, we're seeing then the collapse really of the country and a really pretty grim aspect going forward. The only optimistic sign in the country, I think, is that the international intervention was not totally disastrous. I mean, clearly we lost. The West lost in Afghanistan militarily. They were pushed out and the Taliban took more of the country than they'd had before 2001. But the country itself is very different. More than 60% of the population of Afghanistan, very young population, born since 9/11. And those people have different expectations from the warlords of the past. And I think the Taliban are finding Afghanistan a foreign country in many ways to themselves. And that's one of the reasons why they're having to govern by this very strong sort of terrorist, effectively, activities against people in order to try and control the population.
So there are reports that there are some of those factions within the Taliban who are looking for international legitimacy. So should there be a probe into these allegations of summary executions or forced disappearances, who would undertake it? Would it be the United Nations, or what other multilateral platform, under which terms of reference, in order to bring about accountability?
It's very hard to see that happening, and it's very hard to see the Taliban agreeing to such an investigation. And frankly, even if they managed to come into even if there were investigators who managed to come into the country to try and carry out something like that, it's very hard to see that they'd be able to get anything like the sort of evidence that they need, because they wouldn't have the support of the Taliban themselves. There's no will on the part of the Taliban to resolve these issues, because they don't. I mean, while they want international recognition, while they want the UN seat, they want more to be able to control Afghanistan and to be able to control Afghans in their own way, and that means controlling through fear. And in many ways, it rather suits the leadership of the Taliban, even though they may say that they're not ordering these killings, that it may suit them that they're going on.
Now, just the way forward for the Taliban itself, it said that as a grouping they operated in a rather decentralized fashion as an insurgent force, but that there were local commanders who had their own prerogative to formulate policy. What then does the future hold for the group?
Well, I think the future holds for the Taliban and for Afghanistan pretty grim future, just certainly going forward in these next few months. You're absolutely right that the field commanders, the younger commanders, have a very different view of how to run things than the older men who, many of whom have been in Doha for some years now. There's the significant leadership of the Taliban who are living in Doha. Their children are in school and university in foreign countries. And you know, in many ways, they're detached from the Taliban commanders. They're certainly detached from the country itself. And those Taliban commanders on the ground, of course, are much more hardline than the leadership. So they won't be wanting to agree to any international conditions for the kinds of things that the international community might want. And that gives the international community, the donor community, who might want to stop people dying, who might want to have a real interest in the betterment of Afghanistan, might not want Afghanistan to drift again into the arms of an organization like Al-Qaeda as it did in the 1990s. That leaves the international donor community with some real challenges, and there's a lot of head scratching going on. And while I'm in Washington, I've been talking to people about the sorts of options that they're looking at beyond humanitarian aid, and the humanitarian demands are huge. They're talking about some $3 billion this winter just to keep people alive, basic healthcare, basic food supplies. But beyond that, getting the schools properly funded again, getting the health services properly funded again. There are huge challenges in how to do that without going through the Taliban, without effectively rewarding the Taliban for taking the country. And it's very difficult to see how it can be done.
Well, thank you so much for your time and insights. He is former strategic communications advisor to Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani, David Loyn, visiting senior fellow War Studies Department at King's College in London. We're going to take a quick break.